We all are writing about place, and place, especially in Southern fiction, to me is the basis of the stories. I looked up a quote by Eudora Welty because so much of her writing is rooted in place. She says it's where an author's quest for truth starts. And this is a quote from her. The moment the place in which the novel happens is accepted as true, through it will begin to glow in a kind of recognizable glory the feeling and thought that inhabited the novel in the author's head and animated the whole of her work. And that certainly is true for me. I grew up in the city of Charlotte, North Carolina, and I left there in 1985 at the age of 45. Don't do the math, I'm 79. And proud to be 79. And I left there, I realized after I left that I left there so I could write about it. I was too close to write about it when I lived there. Tomorrow's Bread, the title of the book, is taken from a poem. Both of my books are taken from poems. The Dry Grass of August is from my first novel, is from a poem by Robert Penn Warren. This is from a poem by Langston Hughes. And I came across it well into the writing of the book. And when I found the poem, I realized, though I cannot prove this, that he had to have been writing about urban renewal or something like urban renewal. Democracy. Democracy will not come today, this year, or ever through compromise and fear. I have as much right as the other fella has to stand on my 2 feet and own the land. I tire so of hearing people say, let things take their course. Tomorrow is another day. I do not need my freedom when I'm dead. I cannot live on tomorrow's bread. Freedom is a strong seed planted in a great need. I live here too. I want freedom just as you. So then my novel was in the pre-production before publication process, and my publisher told me I needed to change the title. With my first book, it was like, you're going to publish me, anything you want to do is fine with me. My second book, I became a bit of a diva. And I fought for the title. And I said, it's in this poem, and I paid big money to use this poem. And, you know, I'm going to keep it. And they said, well, find another phrase in the poem. And I finally just said no, and they let me keep it. And there are 2 maps, because place is so important. There are 2 maps in the front of the book. One is a map of the city of Charlotte that I got from an Esso, it wasn't Exxon, it was Esso, road map back in the 1950s. And then the other is a blow-up of the neighborhood of Brooklyn. And I had to fight for the maps too, because the publisher said, you can't put a map of Charlotte on a 5x7 page. And I said, watch me. So sometimes it pays to be a bit of a diva. I've had people who tell me they really love maps in books, and they're so glad I fought to keep them. I'll give you just a little bit of an introduction. I have 3 narrators. The first is a 25-year-old African-American woman who is working in an S&W cafeteria in downtown Charlotte, where she has fallen in love with her white boss. And you find out pretty early on in the novel that her boss is the father of their biracial son. And the second narrator is a black preacher. He's in his 50s. And the third narrator is a white woman whose husband is on the planning commission that's going to wipe out Brooklyn. And her point of view is quite different from the point of view of the other 2, the points of view of the other 2. So this is Lorelei. Down in the gully, little sugar whispers, sliding through the night like a ghost. On a pretty day, it calls my boy to it. If I don't catch Hawk first, he'll be halfway to Pearl Street, a bucket in one hand, a net made from a stocking in the other. bent on frogs or crawdads or whatever pulls him down to where that creek lives. He's breathing steady in his bed across the room, not knowing how slippery the mud bank gets in early March, how quick the water could drag him under. Uncle Ray's chickens clucking in their coop, day coming on. Got to rouse Hawk soon, get him fed and dressed. Beebe, my grand, say when he was born, enjoy him being a baby, Rayleigh, it won't last. He's 6 now, long legs, knobby knees, in 1st grade. I walked to Myers Street School with him for a week last September to be sure he knows the way. I tell him about traffic lights. Got to look up and down the street before he crosses. Use the tunnel under the boulevard. We leave the house and he takes my hand, his small in mine, tugging on me to stop so he can holler, "Hey," to Doobie Franklin next door, or Johnny No Age, waving to us from his delivery van, or May Reese Hemphill, heading downtown in a new coat and hat. At the corner of South Myers, Hawk tilts back his head to stare at the school building, 2 stories, chimneys on top. We go inside, down a rackety hall to a room that's different day to day because Miss Madison keeps changing the maps and pictures she hangs on the walls, sets the desks in rows one day, a circle the next. She is short and full-built, in dresses that hug her waist and stretch tight across her backside. Hawks say she smells good. She calls me Mrs. Hawkins, thinking a mother must be married. The day I drop in to take Hawk his lunch he forgot, I see him leaning against Miss Madison, her hand on his back, like he's special to her. Now he gets to school on his own, with Desmond, his friend that lives behind us. I stand out front and watch him going away from me, slim like his daddy, his round head bobbing while he talks to himself the way he does, then around the corner and out of sight. And then I'll give you just a little bit of the Reverend, who's the second narrator. And the first narrator, Lorelei, is in present tense. My other 2 narrators are third-person past tense, so it's quite a bit different. The Reverend Ebenezer Gabriel Polk sat by his dining room window, staring at motes of dust in a sunbeam that fell across his Bible. He preferred the Revised Standard Version for his personal worship, felt it was the clearest Word of God, though he had not convinced his flock of that. The church's worn King James stayed at the pulpit so he could read from it during sermons, as the congregation expected. The opening pages of the Old Bible recorded the history of the church. St. Timothy's Second Presbyterian was Second Presbyterian Church colored when it was founded in 1842. After the Civil War, the elders elected to drop colored and to add St. Timothy. Why, he often wondered, with that pale saint's Catholic connections. And I'll stop there. The third narrator I won't have time to give you is the white woman, and her story does eventually become interlinked with the other 2 voices. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. So
You want to pull the mic over a little bit?
yeah, can you hear me okay? Okay, great. Thank you. So the first thing I want to say is, so the town that I invented for this is my 3rd novel, half of what you hear, is Gray Hill, Virginia. My publisher made these cute postcards. And I had drawn a map of the town as I was inventing the town that I used as I was doing my writing. And I talked to my publisher about putting it in the book, and they said no. And I'm thinking I should have been much more of a diva. Had I known.
Yay.
Yes.
Let's hear it for divas.
Yes. So I'm sort of local. I live in Arlington, Virginia, so I have some familiar faces in the audience who I want to thank for coming out, including my husband and 2 kids who are here. Yeah. So, as I said, this is my 3rd novel. My first novel, Half of What You Hear, or excuse me, How Lucky You Are, is a story about, one reviewer described it as the growing pains of long friendships. It's about 3 long-term friends and the changes their lives undergo as they get older and get married and start to have children and that kind of thing. And it also has a strong domestic violence storyline in it. And for that, I did a lot of research talking to domestic violence survivors, which you can imagine was emotional work. The next book that I wrote, Save Me, is a story about a marriage, not my own. I always qualify if I'm in front of an audience. It's about the complexities of marriage and long relationships, and it's set in Durham, North Carolina, which is where I was living at the time when I wrote it. And it's about a woman who's a doctor, Daphne, who's always followed a very careful script for her life, and then as her marriage starts to change, she starts to wonder whether that's the life that she wants, checking off all the boxes and dotting every I and crossing every T. So I love both those books and the characters in them, but when I started to write Half of What You Hear about 4 years ago, I really wanted to write a story that was less interior action, less inside the characters' heads, and I wanted to do something different. I wanted to do something that was very dynamic with lots of characters and lots of action. I love a book with a rich setting where the place is as much a character as the characters in the book. And so I'm thinking of books like Empire Falls by Richard Russo or the Big Stone Gap series by Adriana Trigiani. And we had just moved back to the DC area, which I also grew up here, after about 20 years. And I had spent some time in and around Madison, Virginia, which is where I grew up going to summer camp. So when I started to write, I really had that landscape in mind with the Blue Ridge Mountains in the distance, that kind of thing. And as I continued to think of what Gray Hill, Virginia would be, I also had Middleburg in mind, a place that I also love to visit, a beautiful town, sort of a posh town, where whenever I would go visit there when we first moved, we'd walk around the downtown, the cute streets, and see the cute shops, and I'd think, wow, my blood pressure would feel like it would drop 20 points, and I'd think, what would it be like to live here and have a little house, that kind of thing. So that's sort of what Gray Hill is. It's a very sort of bucolic, beautiful, Pleasantville kind of a place, but I wanted it to have sort of a dark underbelly and some secrets. So this book is really about a woman, Bess, who is the former White House social secretary, and she has been fired under a cloud of scandal, which I won't get into here for a variety of reasons. And so they move back to Gray Hill, which is her husband's hometown, because they have an opportunity to start a business there. And she's having a hard time fitting in because of the scandal that cost her her job. People think that they already know who she is and already have some preconceived notions about her. And then she becomes acquainted with another woman who's new again to the town, Susanna Gray Hill Lane, who is the last living descendant of the town's founders. And Susanna is in her early 70s. She left Gray Hill when she was 18 after a mysterious death of her best friend. And she hasn't been back. And people have a lot of questions about what she's doing back in town. She also owns a lot of the land in town and is thinking about turning it into subdivisions, which nobody's happy about. Mm-hmm. So these two become acquainted. Nobody's really happy about their friendship. But Susanna starts to tell secrets to Bess about the town and the town's history that really starts to get her questioning the entire town, her family, her husband, all sorts of things. And there are a lot of twists and turns as you go throughout the book. So it's much a story about a town as it is about these women's friendships and sort of the preconceived notions we have about people who we don't really know. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read the prologue, which is from Susanna's point of view. And it's about something that happens to Susanna in the beginning of the book that becomes a thread throughout the story. So this scene also has to do with humidity, so it's fitting. So. Okay. Susanna. Even with the windows rolled down, the air feels thick and hot. Like drowning in chowder, Teddy used to say, although he didn't know humidity like this. New York could get warm in the summer, even unbearably so, but it wasn't Virginia. Susanna had forgotten just how bad it could get. She's sweating in a way that a lady should never admit. That was something she might have said once in her old life, winking to her well-heeled friends to indicate that she didn't really buy into the stodgy rules she'd been raised with. And her palms are slippery against the steering wheel. Its perforated leather reminds her of the one in the Cadillac that her father had driven. She leans into the open frame of the window and pushes her foot on the gas, encouraging the breeze. She'd wanted a truck like this her whole life. It's red, a Chevy Fleetside pickup. She'd first seen it in an advertisement in the back of the New York Times in 1967. She was 19 then, living in the Barbizon Hotel on 63rd Street. Occasionally over the years, she'd mentioned the truck to Teddy. Not in any serious way, just in passing, daydreaming aloud, the way you might say that it could be fun to climb the Great Wall someday or see the Northern Lights. But because he was Teddy, he filed the nugget away. He was always listening, even when he seemed like he wasn't. And on her 60th birthday, she found it parked in the circular drive of their summer house, a bow the size of an inner tube tied over the hood. She remembers the shock of it, the first time she saw the truck and how it filled her with good feelings, warm feelings, loving feelings. This is what he could do to her. It was as if she were one of the precious crystal water pitchers she'd received as wedding gifts, and his actions could fill or empty her, depending. She turned to him in the driveway that day, shocked and elated, her fingertips pressed against her lips, and then ran and wrapped her arms around his starched shoulders, just like he knew she would. Her friends commented on how fortunate she was to have this doting and generous husband, but they didn't know the half of it. That was 10 years ago now. Teddy is gone, his body buried in Connecticut beside his horrible mother last year. The summer house is gone too. She's back in Virginia, living in the house she grew up in, a move some people might describe as full circle. She takes a deep breath, the thick air in her mouth like chowder. So much in her life has changed, and yet she's realized recently, so much hasn't. Like the radio, for instance, still playing Patsy Cline all these decades later. I fall to pieces. She chuckles to herself, noticing the sick irony of it. And this lazy stretch of asphalt, Whippoorwill Road. The pines are still densely packed on either side, soldiers marking a path. The mottled metal mailboxes are familiar, the wooden plaques carved with house numbers and nailed to the trees. Even if she doesn't know the people inside them, she knows the little houses in her blood. Eyelet curtains hanging in the windows, porches jammed with rusting furniture, the occasional horse slapping at something with its tail, blackberry brambles, the sharp scent of someone burning something in their backyard. Gone for more than 50 years, she thinks. With all the land in the expansive blue sky, the breeze in her hair, the mountains beyond, she should feel free, released, but she doesn't. Instead, she's anxious, a single leaf floating aimlessly through the air. She sticks her hand out through the open window and feels the liquid warmth of the wind through her fingers. Her eyes dart through the trees. She rubs a sweaty palm against her skirt, pink Norma Kamali, bought in 1983 after she saw it on the runway. Her eyes dart from side to side. She realizes she's swerving, kicking up gravel on her right side. Jesus, she mutters, shaking her head at herself, and then takes another deep breath, her hands at 10 and 2. Maybe it's time to turn around. She reaches for the radio dial. She's losing the signal. When she looks up, there's the slightest bend in the road, easy and gradual. A bead of sweat runs down her temple. She flicks the heel of her hand against the side of her head, runs a finger across her upper lip. There's no AC in the truck. The wind is hot. The sun is beating down on the hood. It's 1 o'clock in the afternoon, August in Central Virginia. What was she thinking? The static on the radio is getting worse. She reaches to turn it off, and when she looks up, the bend in the road, there's another car, a sort of goldish beige, sleek, barreling fast. She hugs her side of the road, but the car is coming faster, right toward her, in fact, the glare from the sun a white streak across the windshield. She lays on the horn, pounds at it, but it barely whimpers. She always meant to mention it to Teddy, how it never worked. The car, it's crossing. She opens her mouth and screams. The wind stops. The air is still, searing. The locusts buzz in the trees around her. The sound unforgiving, an electric singe that feels like it's coming from inside her. She tastes blood in her mouth. She hears the sound and the trill of a bird in the distance, a pine warbler, she thinks, remembering. She opens and closes her eyes and wonders if this is the end. She thinks to herself, tries to say it again, over and over. How many times has she said it? Help. So that's the prologue. Thank you. I think I'm just under the wire on time, so there we go.
Yeah. I told her if she missed the signal, I would punch her. But I missed the signal. I was so engrossed in the signal.
Thank you.
Well, it's a great honor to be here. I'm Patsy. Oh, sorry. Here we go. Better? I'm Patsy, or Patricia Harman, from Morgantown, West Virginia. Not that far away, but a little bit cooler up in the mountains. It's a great honor to be follow these guys. Is that great? Did you guys really like their stuff? In fact, it makes me a little humble. Like, I have like 7 or 8 books out, and it's pretty bad if you can't remember if it's 7 or 8, right? But this book is part of a series of historical fiction that starts during the Great Depression, and this book is now up to 1941, just before Pearl Harbor. I actually am a nurse midwife, and so all my protagonists have some connection to midwifery. And one of the neat things about writing these books is that I get to go around talking to people about midwifery, and a lot of people don't know much about it. I'm a nurse midwife, which means that it's like a nurse practitioner who can work in a hospital, or I could do home births if I wanted to, and I have done them. I started off being a home birth midwife, in fact. And a lot of people don't know that 80% of the babies worldwide are born into the hands of midwives. And in the United States, it's about 5%, but it's growing. And if I had more time, I could tell you why. But I'm going to talk about my book. So what I liked about their books is you had such a sense right away of the characters, didn't you? I mean, you cared about them. That's amazing to get that so quickly, I think, in a book. And now that I'm going to read you some from mine, I'm going gee, I hope I did a good enough job. Because my books might be slow starters, I'm not sure. People tell me they couldn't put it down and then they didn't want it to end, which in my way of thinking, that's like a good book. I like books like that. But I'm just really impressed with their books. So this is set just before Pearl Harbor. I'll give you an idea of who the characters are. Patience Hester is the main midwife, a home birth midwife, and in a day where home birth was not a radical thing. It was what people did. You had your baby at home mostly, unless you lived in a city or a big town where they would have a hospital. So Patience is the main midwife. Her husband is Daniel, a veterinarian, and her best friend is Bitsy, an African-American, a younger woman, about 10 years younger than Patience, who is her assistant and is growing into her own as a midwife that could be independent. One of the things I like to include in my books is diversity, and it'll be everything from racial diversity to maybe including people who have disabilities, people who have who are gay, things like that. And they're old-timey books, but these things were true always, right? And in West Virginia, if you live in the north, we're considered Southerners. If you live in the South, we're Yankees. And where I live is almost in Pittsburgh. It's an hour and a half from Pittsburgh. So you notice I have no accent. And if you know the state at all, it's like the Mason-Dixon line, the accent changes straight across. And the people in southern West Virginia have quite a twang. And I can tell right away if they grew up down south in that heavy coal mining area. So my fictional town is Liberty, West Virginia. Patience has quite a history. She was a radical in Pittsburgh. She at one point was on the run for a murder that happened, and now she's sort of settled down. Even though it's about a midwife, I just want to reassure you, it's not all about childbirth, because there are some people that are like, ugh. Some people are like, oh yeah, midwife book, I love it. I watched that show called The Midwife on PBS. Other people are like, well, I guess I'll review this book, but I hope it's not icky. And and most of it is not. I guess you could skip the parts if you don't like that kind of stuff. But midwives are great characters because they walk the line between life and death, especially a home birth midwife. And in some ways they have to be warriors. And so if you're going to pick a female protagonist, you could have a cop, a detective, or a midwife. So, and I have 2 sections I want to read you. One is just a short part about a birth, and it doesn't have anything icky in it. And then the other one is a little more political about when Pearl Harbor happened. Oh, thank God. Are you the midwives? I'm Mr. Fay. We just drove down from Pittsburgh for a Sunday ride in the country, and now my lady friend, Opal, has gone into labor. We stopped in Liberty, but there's no hospital. Someone at the Mountaintop Diner told us about you. The thing is, she's too early. Her physician at West Penn Hospital says she's due near the end of January. Bitsy stares at the man, then looks at me as we both calculate how premature the baby will be. Almost 2 months, unless the doctor is wrong. Well, you've come to the right place. We have a little lying-in home on the farm that we call the baby cabin. Would you like to see it? Why don't you bring Opal inside, and I can at least examine her and tell you what I think. Maybe there's time for you to get to Boone Memorial in Torrington. Bitsy is way ahead of me. She's already assisting Opal, who's of African descent, out of the auto and guiding her along the stone path toward the cabin. The expectant mother is a look-alike for the young Marian Anderson, the famous colored opera singer. I catch up with them at the porch just as Opal has a contraction. Oh, baby doll, I'm so sorry, Mr. Fay says, the leather suitcase banging against his legs as he turns to get the door. From the look of his heavy tweed suit, his shiny shoes, and his fancy auto, he's a city slicker for sure. Just as we get Opal inside, she gives a great grunt. Her water bag breaks, but having set up the baby cabin for just such eventualities, I grab a handful of folded rags and wipe up the mess. The fluid is clear, and that's a good thing. Oh my God! Opal waves one hand in a frantic way as if trying to bat the pain away, and then leans down with both hands on her knees. Something's coming. It's a foot. This is not good. But that's all you get to hear. You have to read the book to find out what happens to Opal. And I will tell you, Mr. Fay is kind of a slime ball. He leaves while she's having the baby. And now Opal is stuck down here in the country. She has no way to get back to Pittsburgh. He just left her. So the next part I'm going to read you. How are we doing with time? 3 minutes. It's got to be short. Okay. They're at a schoolhouse, and I don't know if you guys knew this, but before World War II was raging in Europe, and most of the United States did not want to participate. They called it Europe's War. And they had just gotten out of World War I, and they were not anxious to send our young men and our resources over there to help the people. But Patience and her husband Daniel have gone to a meeting of what was called America First. And it was a coalition of people who could have been radical socialists to Christian right to conservatives. All kinds of people did not want to get in that war. So once at the schoolhouse, we find seats near the back, and I'm surprised to see about 30 people present. I glance around the room to see who's here. Sitting up front are our good friends Becky and Isaac Bloom. Years ago, we all lived together when I was pregnant with Mira and bleeding. Becky, in fact, took over the home births in the county since I was on bed rest. Then 5 years ago, Becky and Isaac, Daniel and I, along with our neighbors, the Maddocks, adopted 4 little Hucknall sisters, Sonia, Sally, Sunny, and Sue. I wave at Becky, and when she smiles, I remember how much I miss her. We're all so busy lately, working, taking care of our families. B.K. Bittman, the grocer, is here with his wife, Lily, along with Ida May, the town hairdresser. Mr. Stinger, the balding pharmacist, and his wife, Mrs. Stinger, are sitting up front. Even one-armed Wetzel is present, standing in back next to the sheriff. The guest speaker, Senator Holt of Weston, West Virginia, tall, shock of white hair, very pink face, begins his speech as if he's standing in front of Congress. Shall the United States become a merchant of death? Holt asks rhetorically in a booming voice. Daniel leans forward. My fellow Americans, the speaker continues, adjusting his spectacles, we're being bamboozled. No nation threatens us. President Roosevelt and his cronies are trying to convince people that if we don't enter the war in Europe, the U.S. will be Germany's next target. But that's not the case, and it's never been. This is a slippery slope, folks. I'm going to skip a little since my time is getting short. Somebody there having a little argument, and the people are standing up arguing, and we have to take care of our own. We have to mind our own business. Finally, we break for coffee and cake served by the Methodist women. Then at 3, BK gets up in front of everyone, and Senator Holt comes to the front. Again, thank you for coming, he says. Americans must show courage. If you believe in an independent destiny for our country, if you believe that we should not enter Europe's war, we ask you to sign this petition and join American First. Just then, the oak doors of the school slam open, and we all turn around. It's Looney Tinkshell from the Texaco station, almost running down the aisle. Dan and I look at each other. Looney hands the speaker a piece of paper, and the speaker's face goes white. Senator Holt turns to BK, whispers something, and then returns to the podium. Ladies and gentlemen, this meeting is over, the senator says abruptly. I ask that you leave in an orderly fashion and drive straight home with great care. I've just been handed a telegram from Washington that says that this morning at 7:48 a.m. Hawaii time, Japanese Air Force bombed the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor. The attack is still going on. Thousands of sailors and officers are dead, as well as civilians. What we say here is no longer of consequence. God be with you all. God bless America. Well, I'll just tell you one more thing to add to the drama. It turns out that Daniel Hester, the veterinarian, fought in World War I and killed in that war, of course. And he promised his maker he would never kill again. So now it's World War II, and he declares himself a pacifist. My husband was a conscientious objector during the war in Vietnam, and so I know a lot about that movement. But to be a conscientious objector in World War II, where we were fighting Hitler, was quite a different thing, and I thought it would be interesting to explore that dynamic and that drama.
Thank you.
I think we have time for questions
Yeah, we're going to take some questions.
or comments.
Yes.
Excuse me, but the middle person. Yes. You made me think of all three of you. When you were reading, you talked about the steering wheel with the perforated
Yeah.
cover on it, okay?
Uh-huh.
When I read books, that's what gives the character to the book, that because now I can picture the perforated thing. You talked about the balding man. Do you write the story and then go back and say, oh, the steering wheel needs a perforated cover? I mean, because are you visualizing it and writing it at the time? The man was balding, you know, the slippery slope, because that is what makes books very special, is all that detail.
Yeah.
Is it added afterwards or as you write?
For me, it's as I write. So in college I studied poetry primarily, so I could spend all day just trying to write a pretty sentence, and it's the plot that is the hardest part for me. So I will spend a long time before I start working on the story, just writing. And usually it's about the character, and those sensory details I think are what really makes a story. So for my first draft, I'll spend a lot of time just kind of getting it out, and I'll set a pretty high word count each day. I'll try to write 2,000 words a day about. And I just really just let myself go, kind of stream of consciousness. And that's typically when those sort of sensory things come out. And then I'll go back sort of like a sculptor with clay, like a pile of clay, and try and build the story out from there. That's typically, it's not quite that linear. I wish it was. It'd make my job a lot easier, but that's how I try to do it at least. So.
You know, when I first started writing, and I don't have any training, she went to school for writing. My training is in delivering babies and women's health. But when I first started, I think I was visualizing as it went. And then sometimes when I get stuck, I try to just say, write the story. Just write the story. And then I end up going back for the little details. I think that's a good point, though, and to me, it's those small things that kind of bring the picture up to you. the thing I don't like, and what I like about these guys' books, is it just, I don't like it when people go overboard with the description, like it maybe lasts for 2 paragraphs, and by that time you've forgotten the plot or who's talking. And I find myself skimming a lot in books like that are supposed to be bestsellers. You know, they're like supposed to be really great books.
My details come with the characters. I always write from character. That's where my stories start and end. I have a little reminder across the top of my monitor that says, trust the process, let go of the results. So I don't write to the end of the book. I let my characters speak and tell stories. One detail I didn't read is on Lorelai's trip to work that day, the day that the book starts, and she catches a bus. And she says the mat that runs down the middle of the bus used to have a line on it, and coloreds had to stay behind that line. Well, that's a detail I grew up with, and it came to me after I had written the story of her going to work. So what does Lorelai think about that? And I used the detail. She says, but I like the back of the bus, the long seat under the big window, more detail. Even if I am allowed to ride up front now with those stiff-necked men in their suits and hats. So this is one character and her feeling about these details. And I think that would not be true today. This is 1961. Any questions about writing, the process of writing?
No, not from me. I was just going to say how clearly you could hear the sense of place in all of your books, and that's fascinating to me. I think about places as places to escape to, and your books, I can't wait to escape to them and read them. And then, just as you said, trust the process, let go of the results. I am going to use that for the motto of my life.
Oh,
Ooh.
Because
Absolutely.
it's so strong. So thank you for that.
yeah.
I really appreciate it. And I appreciate all of you being here. It was wonderful.
I have to add one thing. I used to have a piece across the monitor that's now ingrained in me, but it was from Flannery O'Connor, and I'm convinced she was talking to writers. You shall know truth, and the truth shall make you odd. Isn't that wonderful?
That's great.
Yeah.
I have a question for the diva.
Oh, thank you.
Yes.
The stage manager knows divas, and
Just out of
Krista
curiosity.
Lynn is the stage manager of this event.
Thank you. Just out of curiosity, why did the publisher want you to change your title from Tomorrow's Bread?
They felt it wasn't marketable. That suggestion came from the publicity department at the publisher. And I disagree with that. I think it is a marketable title. And it certainly is supported by the poem at the beginning of the book. And I tried. I read the poem again. I tried to find another phrase. But after I discovered the poem, I was really writing to it. And so the rest of the book was affected by that. I'm glad you asked that.
Yes, and I can say that is definitely something that that's going to be something that I'm going to pick up because in what's going on in our society, the gentrification
I know.
in this century, 21st century, is rather interesting to go back and listen to it from another perspective.
And now they call it gentrification instead of urban renewal.
Urban renewal.
James Baldwin, a really famous African-American writer, called it Negro removal, and that's very pertinent.
What was how were you inspired to write this?
I grew up in Charlotte, and I was going back for my 50th high school reunion, and I drove through downtown, and I saw all this green space, and I thought, why haven't they built on it? It's been 45, 50 years since they wiped out Brooklyn, and that got me to thinking about the people who lived there, who were no longer there, where had they gone? So that was the genesis of it.
How old is your book?
It came out March the 26th this year.
Okay.
Yeah.
I'm curious as to why when you started writing and what you did prior to writing.
Oh, no, please.
I was a court reporter in the 70s. In the 80s, I managed an opera company. And in the late 80s to the late 90s, I was medical writer and editor on an international medical journal. So it's been a very checkered career. But I think the court reporting gave me my dialogue, my sense of dialogue. The opera gave me my sense of drama and appreciation for stage managers. And then the medical writing gave me my appreciation of the necessity of research. And certainly if you write historical fiction, you've got to research. I was writing all that time, though, and I'm in a writing group I've been in for 33 years. Yeah.
I wanted to talk about her title, the titles. You know, since I didn't go to school for writing, I didn't know anything about the publishing industry or anything. It took me, just in case there's budding writers in here, I wanted to find an agent. I was willing to consider self-publishing, but I knew that it would be nice if someone would pay me for the book instead of me having to pay to have it published. So it took me 73 rejection letters to agents. And I'm just telling you guys that because if you say you've gotten rejected 10 times, that's not enough. And then one day, on the same day, I got 2 agents that called me. So, but what I was going to say about titles, I had no idea that once you sell your book to somebody, they make the cover, they choose the title. And my title for my first book about the midwives in the Great Depression was Sound of the Heart. And the reason I like that title is kind of poetic, and you know it has a lot to do with our human condition. And the midwife is always going around at birth, listening to the baby's heartbeat to make sure everything is okay. But they, like her book, they wanted to market it, right? And the series called The Midwife had just come out on PBS, so they wanted to get midwife in the title, which actually I think was a good marketing thing. But they named the book The Midwife of Hope River, which was very simple, and I didn't think, that's not very poetic, The Midwife of Hope River. But now I really like it because the theme of all my books is about hope. And so now I do think it's poetic. But it's just interesting, things like that you wouldn't know, right? At least I didn't know things like that they get to pick your cover. My publisher is nice, though, and they let me, if I don't like their title, then they make me try to think up another one, and usually I end up capitulating. But my new one that I'm writing about in 1956 is called The Midwife's Song, and I'm sticking with it. I'm going to use her for my...
Right. Be a diva.
Yeah.
And you guys, we don't have much time, but we have some postcards and different things if you guys want to take them. And anybody who wants to come over and get their book signed will be over at the booth.
Kristyn, do you have anything to add?
I think so, yeah. Yeah, yeah.
About
Answer-
titles?
Oh, about titles. So about titles. So my title, I typically keep a running list of titles as I'm writing, and one day I'll write a phrase, and I'll think, oh, that's it, and then I'll look at it 24 hours later and think that is not it at all. I've been really lucky. I've had the same editor and publisher same editor and agent, for all 3 books, and we really collaborate and work well together. So it's been fairly simple process where we go through a list and kind of cross things out, and I haven't had any issues yet with that. So fingers crossed for the next one. So, yeah.
I want to underline what Patsy said about getting an agent. I got an agent pretty quickly. I was lucky, and part of it really was luck. But it took him 3 years and 3 months to sell my book. Mm-hmm. And with each new rejection, I cried. And, you got to hang in there. And he believed in it. He was like a dog with a bone. So just keep on keeping on if you got a story to tell.
I think that's really important, to believe in what you have to say. I want to reiterate that if you've got a story to tell that has meaning and you think there'll be somebody out there who can learn something from it or be inspired. I'll tell you the best book review I ever got was when I was still practicing midwifery, and it was on a little yellow sticky. It was by a patient, and she had left it at the front desk, and it said, "I laughed, I cried, I was inspired." And isn't that what you want when you read a book?
Can I add one last thing? I know we're trying to wrap up. Sometimes people ask me, well, what's the best thing I can do for should I buy it online? Should I buy the the physical book. What should I do? So I want to say on behalf of these guys and myself, but on behalf of these guys, that the very best thing you can do, sadly, it's true, is to review online. So if you're inclined to read either of these books or my own, review online is the best thing you can do to help authors. So
Go to Goodreads, go to Amazon. There are a bunch of places out there to review, and it's so helpful.
thank you for
Thank
being
you.
here.